Welcome, everybody, to today's town hall. We're going to let everyone jump into the Zoom as they pile in, but we're excited to have you join us for a conversation about baseball and softball in the wake of COVID-19 and how we think about the return to play. So we are excited. We have an unbelievable panel, and it feels like an all-star game of amazing organizations, as well as an incredible health expert that we're going to start off the conversation. But I did want to start by welcoming everyone today. And you know, it's neat to see that that the country is now starting to think about what opening up looks like, and hearing stories of how individual organizations are figuring out what's the safe way to start to establish some normalcy and get kids on some kind of field again and start to have those kinds of conversations. Certainly a far cry from where we were 8 or 9 weeks ago. And we know how challenging this has been for so many organizations, how many questions exist. So really today's conversation is about us helping to surface a lot of the best practices and ideas. Because at a time where no one has the answers, everybody has the answers, right? The community is the authority. And what we really want to do is use today as a conversation, help surface those discussion points. The way this is going to work is you'll see a Q&A tab on the right-hand side. You should feel free to ask a question. Other people can view that and upvote that so I can get a sense of some of the topics you're most interested in. We certainly heard about a lot of those topics in advance already, but certainly encourage you to use that to make sure that we're steering the conversation in a way that's most valuable to you. And then afterwards, we can continue the conversation on the industry Slack channel, the NextUp Slack channel. So we'll make sure everyone has access to that. If you don't know what Slack is, this is your chance. It's a free tool that can be really valuable to your organization. It's been amazingly helpful to the way we run and operate LeagueApps, and a lot of other organizations are using that effectively as well. And so go in Slack, and it's a place not only to meet other baseball and softball organizations, but also meet leading organizations from across the country and every kind of sport imaginable, where you can trade ideas, you can share documents. We'll share that information as well. As I think about today's conversation and we think about baseball and softball, I can't help but think about Yogi Berra, right? I always think about the inspiring quote. And what I was thinking about today is a couple of yogiisms, one of which was, when you come to a fork in the road, take it, right? When you come to a fork in the road, take it. And I actually think that's a really important point right now, because we're at a place of a lot of uncertainty, and a lot of organizations, a lot of people are frozen trying to figure out what to do. And what we believe is the most innovative organizations are the ones who are figuring out how to press forward, how to do that safely, how to do that in mind to get as many kids participating in sports. But the idea is that standing around and waiting isn't the answer. What is the answer is being proactive, being part of these kinds of conversations and figuring out how to improve as an organization and as a leader. There's a study from the Harvard Business Review that I'll make sure see if someone shares in the chat tool that I think is really interesting. Because when you look at the history of every recession or depression that we've had as a country, about 9% of organizations, for-profits or nonprofits, figure out how to go through that and be successful. And the rest of them, a lot of organizations middle around, a lot of organizations end up shutting down. And so to us, I think the question is are you going to be one of those 9% of organizations who use this period of time, who end up coming out of this stronger than ever before? And that's not only a question of how you think about returning to play in the short term, it's really how you're thinking about baseball and softball in the long run. And another thing that Yogi Berra once said was, the future ain't what it used to be. And I think in many respects, the future could be even better. And because I think people appreciate sports in its absence, but I also think there's new kinds of challenges. And so we have to anticipate that. There's a great author by the name of Scott Galloway, an NYU professor, who looked and studied why Apple and Facebook and Google and Amazon are so successful. And he talked about the constant notion of change and how those organizations are amazing at harnessing that. In fact, they got so good at harnessing tools that didn't even exist a year ago or 6 months ago, that's what made them successful. And as all of us have learned with Zoom, we're all learning new kinds of tools. And I think that's a big, important analogy right now, which is there's a lot of change that's happening. The future ain't what it used to be, but there's an opportunity for all of us to lead the way. And certainly by being here today, it's part of that conversation. I'm excited to start, though, in helping to highlight a conversation around health and safety before we hear from some amazing practitioners. So I'm excited to welcome Kat into the conversation. And Kat is a primary care sports medicine doctor at HSS, the Hospital for Special Surgery, and an associate team physician for the New York Mets. HSS is incredible. First, from a medical facility, it's amazing. And I can say that with personal experience. But more importantly than that, they're an incredible advocate with youth sports. And Kat just represents that as well when she talks about kind of thinking about overuse injuries and prevention, but also, and specifically in the context of baseball, but also is aware of, as teams are thinking about return to play, even at the professional level, how they're thinking about things. HSS also has an incredible site called Feel Better from Home with a lot of amazing resources, as well as more specific youth sports resources. So certainly encourage everyone to take advantage of those resources. So Kat, welcome to the conversation, and excited to jump in.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So one question I think that everyone out here wants to understand is what is the best way that baseball clubs, facilities, tournament operators, how do they think about creating a safe return to play? What are the best practices that they should be thinking about? And one of the hard parts is there's so many different sources of information. So where are you turning to? So what advice could you give for them about how they might think about safety and health and wellness?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the hard part about this virus is that everything changes by the day, by the minute. And so a lot of what we knew a month ago is different than what we know today. And even the CDC guidelines have changed over the course of the last 8 weeks. That tends to be the resource I use the most in terms of where to go and proper or safety and return to play is the CDC. But I think you can kind of think about it in 3 large groups. One is minimizing density, just decreasing the number of bodies that are present. 2 is hygiene, and I'll kind of go into more specifics along those lines. And then I think the last piece of it is education, and really just making sure that we take the time to educate our parents, our athletes, and our coaches so that everyone has buy-in, everyone's on board with kind of our new normal, if you will. And I think there are potentially some positives to getting back in this more hygienic way. That might also decrease other types of illnesses that keep kids sidelined. So hopefully there will be some good that comes out of it as well. So from a minimization of density perspective, I think that, you can think through waves of training, maybe having small groups come in at different times, stagger them, have time between the groups to clean any sort of shared equipment, trying to limit essential personnel to really your skeleton crew or the crew that's most necessary. That may mean 1 coach instead of 4 coaches. That may mean that you come in the shifts like we talked about. That may mean that parents watch from their cars or they watch from Zoom. But just trying to decrease the number of bodies that are physically present, I think, is something that we're all really working on right now in the baseball world. And I think part of that stems from some of the more recent discussions from the CDC where we really do think that the primary mode of transmission is being in close contact with another individual by respiratory droplets. Not that contact and surface transfer does not occur. I think that we think that that also occurs, but is probably more of a secondary route of transmission. So I think the more that we can minimize people in a close space, the less likely this virus is to spread. And then so along those lines, from a hygiene perspective, one simple thing is that symptomatic players, coaches, staff just shouldn't be allowed to come to practice. They shouldn't be allowed to come to games. Obviously at the professional sports level, there's been lots of talk about temperature screens and symptom checklists and exposure histories, et cetera, and keeping track of all of those things. And I know for Little League that might be tough, but it's very reasonable to consider at least doing some sort of a symptom inventory before a kid is allowed to come to practice. I think the other piece of that, though, to be aware of is that kids are notorious for being these asymptomatic carriers. So just because you have a bunch of kids who are screening negative doesn't mean that there's no risk. And thinking about kids who might, live at home with elderly relatives, I think that's relevant. From a mask perspective, I think we're lucky in a couple of ways. Baseball, first of all, by nature is an outdoor sport. And it does seem like ventilation and space and being outside is protective. And similarly, I think as it pertains to the droplet transmission and the close contact, masks are also probably a lot more important now than we originally thought 8 weeks ago. And baseball is one of those sports where you can probably get away with playing in a mask at the youth level. I know at the professional level, that's a little bit of a different conversation, but it's not from a cardiovascular perspective so challenging that would be an impossibility. And you could at least have kids and coaches in masks when they're not on the field as one preventative measure. I think hand hygiene, of course, is important and something that everyone's very well aware of, but teaching kids how to actually wash their hands properly. And then just being realistic on a baseball field, you're not going to have sinks with soap and water. So having hand sanitizers and, even little sanitization stations around the field where if there's a throwing station, you keep hand sanitizer there. If there's a batting station, you keep a hand sanitizer there as well. And then similarly, hydration stations so that everyone can have their own water bottle. So they're not sharing from a communal jug that can be labeled and things along those lines. Surface hygiene as it pertains to contact transfer. I think the big thing that the CDC really harps on is using the EPA approved products, which are the cleaning products for surfaces. And the other key with that is they need to stay on the surface for about 2 to 3 minutes to be allowed to dry before they can really be effective. So not just wiping something down and then immediately touching it. So just really thinking about ways to minimize touch points, minimize shared points of contact. Don't try not to share bats if you can help it. And in terms of door handles and indoor facilities, trying to keep doors open, eliminate use of communal water fountains, wiping down weights between kids if they're using the weight room, that kind of thing. And then I think just along those lines, trying to be creative with restructuring things in order to maximize social distancing, in addition to hygiene, is an advantage that we have in our sport by being an outdoor sport in a large surface area type of setting. And, you know, I've seen just walking around some of the parks near Brooklyn, they're doing like spray paint circles that are 6 feet apart from one another. And those are the circles where people are allowed to work out on the grass. And you could easily do, you know, the circle approach where you have kids out doing their band work, doing their strengthening routines 6 feet apart from one another on the field in their designated circle, which would allow them to maintain their strength in an outdoor venue, which not everyone has that ability. And then, you know, in terms of people who actually have locker rooms and shared facilities, trying to be strategic about that. So don't have kids sharing snacks or sharing food or sharing water bottles. If they have lockers, space them out as much as you can. If they're taking a bus to a game, have them not sit in consecutive rows and have the windows open so that the ventilation can be maximized. So those are all little things that I think of when I think about how to operationalize getting back to play, because I think at some point, everyone who goes onto a field or walks into life or to their job in this current climate has to accept some sort of risk. So how can we just minimize that to the best of our ability? And I think the combination of being creative with social distancing and then using hand hygiene, mask hygiene, and then keeping parents, coaches, and kids educated and being kind of creative with how you educate kids, because that can be a challenge. They're not going to understand the same sort of concepts that we will, and they're probably not going to want to wear a mask. You know, one idea I had was the teams could have team masks. And if you have something you feel strongly about, it could be on your mask, and it could be like a way to make a statement. Trying to make the mask thing fun for them, I think could be, at least a step in that right direction, and also a good statement to make that we're abiding by our public health official recommendations. So is that a good start? I can go into
that's amazing. So first of all, I'll encourage anyone to use the Q&A tab if they have some follow-up questions. A few quick other questions to get into. So one is, are there, you mentioned the idea of minimizing density. And so are there different ways that you're advising or you suggest around, forms of play, training versus practices versus games, or people running more tournament formats? Like, what's your thought about either drills or game types that might be most appropriate to kind of minimize risk?
Yeah, it's a great question. In terms of drills, I think, that one of the, I guess, 2 drills I can think of that really don't involve people at all would be batting and base running. You can really do both of those things fairly solo without having shared points of contact. I think a lot of it in baseball is going to be cultural. At the professional level, we're not going to be spitting sunflower seeds and chewing tobacco, and because some of the dugout culture will be changed. The managers probably aren't going to be getting in the umpire's face. So I think that there are definitely just kind of cultural changes in terms of spacing and keeping the necessary officials from an ump perspective at a safe, greater than 6 foot distance from the kids whenever possible. And then probably just trying to minimize your coaching staff to an extent. Like, I don't know at the little league level how many different specialty coaches you need. If you feel like 1 or 2 people could get by, and then maybe you alternate weekends or something along those lines. But because really, ironically, probably the coaches are at greater risk than the kids are. The kids are probably more of a risk factor to some of these coaches. So we want to protect the entire organization, not just the kids, and think about who lives at home with the kids too. A lot of what we're doing right now with risk stratification has to do with thinking about the whole organization, not just our players.
Yeah. One of the questions that came in also had to do with also close contact in dugouts. Any thoughts about, realistic ways to limit contact in dugouts, or strategies you think to think about the professional level that you may have heard about?
Yeah, the only thing I can think of is just really trying to minimize the people who are in the dugout to being people who are actively up to bat or are involved in the game and need to be watching the game. So like if you've got your 3 other starters who are sitting out there just because they're watching the game, they can easily do that from inside the clubhouse on TV. So I think trying to pick who's in the dugout is the first piece of that. The second piece is trying to avoid getting up and walking around and just trying to kind of pick a spot and stay there. But I think even the dugout is better ventilated than most indoor facilities because you're still going to have airflow through there. So that's at least something. But I think the main thing would be your guys who aren't playing that night or your guys who are not pitching that night, trying to make sure that they're not just hanging out in the dugout and really having the dugout be reserved for the strength and conditioning or the athletic trainers, I should say, essential coaching staff, and then players who are actively playing in that game.
Are there there's a distinction between indoor and outdoor? Is there a demonstrable difference in the perspective of risk there? Seems to be implied in the way you're talking about it.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like the ventilation is really important. And so obviously outdoor space is better ventilated. There haven't been any studies that I've seen to date that actually quantify transmission in an outdoor sporting venue. I'd be curious to know, like, when data becomes available, what it shows. There was one study, I think, out of China that showed a very small number of transmission in an outdoor setting compared to indoor settings. But I think that the principle you're operating under is that the better the ventilation, the more likely you're going to have a dispersion of the respiratory viral particles, and therefore you'll be less likely to get the dose that you would need to be exposed to actually contract the illness. So kind of more of a, density of particle as well as density of people.
Right. You have time for a couple quick last questions?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So they're coming in fast and furious. So one is in terms of how baseballs might actually transmit the virus and how that might affect how you think about foul ball returns or anything else. What is the thought about transmission there?
No, it's a great question. I think, the one thing that we've been thinking about is in terms of just it's habit for these guys to start throwing the ball around. Like once the play is done, they just keep throwing it back and forth to each other, and really trying to minimize those types of behaviors where once the play has finished, then you give the ball, back to the catcher. I think in terms of ball sterilization or whatnot, if you could try to clean the balls at the end of each practice potentially, and maybe before each practice starts, again, using these specific EPA approved cleaning solutions, and then allowing them to dry, because that's the biggest piece too. They can't just be wet or they won't have the same sort of effectiveness. But I think that in general, speaking to the earlier comment about transmission, it still seems like it's that being in close contact with a person who's actively speaking, sneezing, coughing, transmitting respiratory droplets onto another person that seems to be the primary mode of transmission. Again, all of this is, it goes without saying that we're still learning about this virus every day, and what I say now could completely change tomorrow, but at least as of this week, that seems to be the emerging theme. So I think that touching a baseball, while if someone went up and blew their nose and then touched the baseball, and then someone else touched the baseball and then they touched their face and then it went in through their mucous membranes, while that's feasible, I think that as long as kids are practicing good hand hygiene and trying to avoid touching their face, which I totally get is harder in the pediatric population, that's probably a less likely mode of transmission than standing next to someone at first base for 10 minutes.
Right. Okay. And then in terms of masks, I guess the question is, especially for an extended period of time, is there any danger or risk to that, especially for kids? Is it not healthy? Is there any risk that we're not thinking about in terms of from a respiratory perspective?
Not that I know of. I think the main risk you would think about would be that the mask becomes ineffective with a certain amount of time. If it becomes soiled or wet, we know that they're not as effective. But I mean, when you think about our frontline workers wearing these masks for, 9, 10, 12 hours a day, the N95s are meant to last 8 hours. I do know that in terms of their effectiveness. So I would imagine that also implies that they're safely used for 8 hours.
Right.
I don't think there's necessarily anything along those lines. Now, if this was a different sport where we were asking a lot of respiratory capacity, I think it would be different. But I think it's relevant because what we do know as well is that the more you're exerting yourself, the more you are actually projecting these particles even further than 6 feet. So, when they talk about running, they're saying it should be more of a 12 to 15 foot rule. So I think max exertion, while in some ways a mask would seem constricting, it's also the time where you're probably most likely to be spreading the virus the furthest. So the nice thing about baseball is it's not sustained max exertion. It's short bursts of it. So that's kind of my thought process on it. I'm not aware of particular evidence that says that there's harm in wearing a mask for a certain amount of time.
Right. And given your expertise, beyond the COVID crisis, we'd be remiss if we didn't ask a question about injuries and risk, because kids have been doing things differently now. Maybe they're getting out and practicing again. Any suggestions about the best way to minimize kind of risks of injuries or overuse, especially if there's a time where kids have been a little bit less active?
Yeah, it's a great question too. And I think I'll start with a positive comment. I really hope that this, the one silver lining of this COVID pandemic is that we might actually have less overuse injuries this year in the youth baseball population. I think as everyone on this call is probably well aware of, these kids are playing on numerous teams, numerous positions, pretty much year-round baseball. And the American Academy of Pediatrics and various baseball organizations, based on some of the data that we have on injury risk profiles, really do recommend 3 to 4 months of consecutive time away from throwing. And away from baseball activity. So this pandemic in some ways has afforded them that amount of time, which may in the long run be somewhat protective for overuse injuries over the course of a calendar year. But in terms of a ramp up, I think the thing we talk about a lot is this whole acute on chronic workload. And so the way to think about that is the amount of effort you've spent within the last week. How does that compare to the amount of effort you've spent within the last month? And kind of using that ratio to help guide injury risk versus also ability to improve performance. Because if you're below a certain percentage, we know you're not going to get better. If you're above a certain percentage, you might get hurt. So thinking about a gradual return and a gradual ramp up where it's not just pitch counts that you're monitoring, but off days. And then making sure that these guys are still paying attention to muscular endurance is a huge piece too. And I'm sure other people on this call could speak to that far better than I. But the biggest thing I notice in these kids is that their scapula and their scapular stabilization muscles are inadequate. Their core strength is inadequate, and they fatigue. And when they fatigue, their biomechanics change. And one of the risk factors that has been proven in the literature time and time again is that pitching while fatigued in the youth baseball population does lead to injury. So the more that we can work on their muscular endurance, the less likely they'll run into troubles when they go back to a relatively rapid ramp up compared to what they've been used to.
One observation I've seen is that, you HSS have been advocating for a while for what's the best way to minimize risks of injuries, how to focus on that part of the game around flexibility and strength training in addition to what happens on the field. And now there's an opportunity, an invitation to have this conversation around health and safety. And so organizations can do that well. One, there's ways to be able to help deliver some of that feedback virtually. There's ways to be able to do that through individual training or individual exercises. So lots of opportunities, I think, to lean in and not only address what's happening with COVID, but more importantly, be even a more effective organization afterwards. So the more that you have this expertise, the more that you're focusing on this, the better. So it's I think there's a huge opportunity to leverage all the incredible work that HSS has done. So thank you, Kat, for being here. If your questions weren't answered, we'll follow up with HSS to make sure we get a few of those answered as well. I think you're about the Pete Alonso of medical professionals here. You kind of crushed that one. So I want to thank you for being with us. It's great for you to translate that.
Oh, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. Happy to answer.
Awesome.
Questions. All right.
Sounds good. So we'll follow up with you, and I'm going to welcome in the rest of our panel. But that was awesome. Have a great day, Kat, and stay safe. Kerry King, Charlie, Donny, and Joe, let's turn your cameras on and have you join us. And I was tempted to keep going, except I realized we have such a great conversation in front of us. I had to pull the plug, but hopefully there'll be some ways we can react to a lot of those ideas around return to play. So I am ecstatic for the conversation we're going to have around baseball and softball, bringing all kinds of different perspectives to today's conversation. And I'm going to start and put Charlie on the spot, representing the Washington Nationals, the Nationals Youth Baseball Academy, and start. One of the things that we've been honored to collaborate both with Major League Baseball as an investor and work with all the different youth academies, including the Nationals. And I've been to the Nationals Academy. It is mind blowing, not just what it means in terms of baseball and softball in that area, but also what it means to kids and the opportunities you provide. So maybe give everyone 30 seconds of overview about what the Nationals Baseball Academy does, and then more importantly, talk about how you've been handling and responding to the kind of pause and play.
Understood. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. So Nats Academy, we just celebrated our 6th birthday, believe it or not. We are part of a public-private partnership when the Montreal Expos moved to Washington, D.C. So it was a partnership with the city and the team itself. We have a baseball oasis, as I call it. It's a 10-acre campus. We have multiple turf fields and then a learning clubhouse with organic gardens, a learning kitchen, and 10 classrooms. I'm in the admin space right now. There's just a couple of us here. But we use the sports of baseball and softball to foster positive character development, academic achievement, and promote overall wellness for children living in the more underserved communities of DC. So we've had to reinvent operations since March 12th. We have essentially become a meal distribution site with a partnership with Chef Jose Andres and World Central Kitchen. Nats Park, the stadium kitchens have been active again, and they produce over 10,000 meals a day and distribute a good amount of meals to us, so we can then distribute to our hundreds of families that we serve in Southeast Washington, D.C., which is the most underserved part of the city.
That's amazing. Well, it's amazing to hear about that, and it's, you know, I know you play such a role in the community. Continue to do that. Joe Lopez, welcome to the conversation. Joe's someone I've gotten to know, and you know, it seems like just yesterday we were hanging out at the ABCA, having hot chicken from Nashville's, from Hattie B's, and now we're obviously in a different situation. But it's good to see you virtually. And I'll encourage everyone else. I'll have someone post the video. Joe and I did an interview with Sports Business, a great video series where he talked a lot about the innovations that they're doing as part of the Gators Baseball Academy. But Joe brings the perspective not only from Gators baseball, but also brings the perspective from volleyball, because he's now involved in one of the top volleyball clubs in Florida. And on top of that, brings incredible business experience from your time as CEO of Integrated Opening Solution, as well as managing partner of Solstice Partners. So you got a wealth of experience here. Maybe just for everyone here, for context, describe what is the Gators Baseball Academy in terms of reach, and what the kind of core aspects of what you do.
Yeah, so the Gators Baseball Academy, first of all, Jeremy, thanks for having me, buddy, and you know, hello to everybody else. The Gators Baseball Academy is a 6-year-old baseball academy. We are headquartered in St. Louis, Missouri. We have a nice campus there. It's not as beautiful, Charlie, as what you're speaking to, but we do have about 28,000 square feet indoor for baseball training, and then an additional 20,000 square feet for strictly strength conditioning and athletic performance. Our club has 85 teams in it. We start at the age of 6 all the way through 18. We have 4 pillars that really are the fundamental of for our club. We believe in building community. We believe in fostering character. We believe in enhancing talent. And then our 4th pillar is we are changing the game. The game that we are in the middle of today, we know that through our efforts and many of our colleagues' efforts, it'll be different for the next generation.
That's great. And Joe, I'm excited to hear, because I know one of the things you're constantly innovating, and that's certainly accelerated during this crisis. Donny, excited to welcome you to the conversation, coming out of Detroit. So we had Florida, and we have Detroit, we had Washington, D.C. Donny's the director of softball operations at Total Sports Complex for the past 11 years, and also been with Finesse Fast Pitch since 1992. And you know, also played college baseball himself. So maybe give us a little bit of overview of Finesse Fast Pitch and Total Sports, so we know what kind of experience you're bringing to the conversation.
Yeah, sure. Again, I also want to say thank you and LeagueApps for having me. I could have listened to Dr. Kat the whole time. I was taking notes like crazy. She is awesome with great information. As Jeremy said, I wear 2 different hats. One, I'm a director of Total Softball. It's a softball academy that does camps, clinics, lessons, all that good stuff. And our parent company is Total Sports Complex, which has multiple facilities in Michigan and Ohio. And we have over 2 million people a year come through our facility. I've got a great boss at Total Sports. They let me spend about 70 to 80% of my time running the Finesse Fast Pitch organization. Between myself and the president, Tommy Walker, it's been in existence since 1986. As Jeremy said, I've been involved since 1992. And we have 24 teams. We play the majority of our schedules, and our teams are national level teams. So we travel around the country, putting our kids in front of college coaches in the hopes of getting scholarships. And of course, that world is changing hourly as we speak.
That's great. Well, and last but not least, Kerry King. Kerry King is a new friend of mine and a co-conspirator, collaborator, as he's one of the brains behind the Play Sports Coalition. He and I are honored to co-chair that together, really mobilizing almost 4,000 organizations to help advocate in Washington and elsewhere for the needs of the youth local sports industry. And it's been neat to see the success of that. Kerry, I'll make sure we'll get a question in on that. But for this conversation, Kerry also wears the hat as the CEO of Triple Crown Sports, which needs little introduction, built an empire of youth events across the country, not just in baseball and fast pitch, but also other sports as well. And you know, I noted that you did executive education courses at Harvard Business School, which explains why you're so savvy. We've had lots of great conversations, and it'd be great to hear you describe a little bit about what is the Triple Crown empire that you've built, and also, and how would you describe how you've had to be, and have you been impacted by this youth sports pause?
Thanks, Jeremy. Yeah, Triple Crown Sports, we produce baseball and softball events and a couple other sports as well, all around the United States. We're most well known in baseball for the Slump Buster event in Omaha that coincides with the NCAA College World Series, and then the Sparkler Fireworks for girls fast pitch here in Colorado. And you know, our events have been greatly affected during this time frame, and as states reemerge here, we're working directly with governors now and have a campaign going in Colorado and California to really try and showcase how baseball and softball can be done in a safe manner here in June. And so we've been working on that since April and done a lot of work in that regard. And love sports. You know, for me, our mission at Triple Crown and purpose is to use the sport event as a vehicle for lifetime memories and of joy, challenge, and grandeur. And we've been doing that since 1982. For me personally, sports have saved my life. There's lots of research out how sports can save youngsters' lives as well. It does teach you emotional resilience on how to deal with personal loss, personal adversity, personal mistakes, and personal failure. And life is only going to set you up with bigger and bigger losses over time. And without sports, I really think the resiliency in young people is not happening right now. So I'm really concerned that we're not on the diamond, that we're not in the pitch, we're not on the court, we're not on the field. And I can't wait for us to get back to some normal ball.
Yeah, when you, Terry, just to stick with you quick, if you can maybe sum up quickly, you've done an amazing job navigating financially through this. And I think a lot of organizations are trying to figure out how they kind of get through this. What's been your experience, your advice about, you know, the strategy that you've used to really kind of get through this massive disruption so that you're in a position to thrive afterwards?
Multifaceted way. I mean, we're balancing refunds and transfers, pushing money into the future. So we're using the customer a little bit to help us move forward, and they're willing to do so because of our long-term relationship. But we also needed bank financing, and so we utilized PPP. We've kept a close bank relationship for years, and it's really paid off. We're getting the PPP pretty early. Now we've got our building up, potentially going to be used as leverage, and we're looking at Main Street lending in a great capacity, waiting for it to open. The EIDL 7A wasn't much action there, and so we kind of have diverted in hopes for Main Street. We think it's good debt to acquire. Otherwise, we'd look at a restructure or selling some equity. We don't feel like we're there yet, but that's a potential if it keeps going and going and going where we don't play ball.
Yeah, it's great to hear the kind of multi-pronged strategy. One thing you mentioned, and I think it's an important strategy, is can you creatively go to your customers to help them help keep your organization around? I just posted a couple stats from a morning consult poll, and the LeagueApps team will post kind of the link to the overall story. But what I thought was really interesting is, first of all, a lot of parents are concerned about the survival of organizations. I think over 55% have that concern. But what I thought was really interesting is 54% of all parents surveyed who have kids that play sports, believe that they would be willing to prepay for future seasons to help those programs kind of weather the pandemic, and 60% would be willing to pay a premium for things that made those organizations more safe. So there's lots of ways and strategies of how you enlist them as part of that solution. Joe, one question for you is, a lot of organizations are struggling with this question of refunds and how they're managing financially through this time. How have you kind of navigated that and try to figure out ways of adding value in the short term where you couldn't get on the field?
No, that's a great question. Keri, thank you for sharing that perspective, by the way. From the onset, Jeremy, for us, we treated the organization very seriously. We've measured success by thinking about our organization being here in 30 years. And so we immediately, onboarded, operational folks, accounting folks. We set things like organizational structures. We aligned ourselves with banks. We kept cash as a reserve. And so for us, we moved through PPP and we moved through SBA disaster relief funding pretty seamlessly, quite frankly. And we have not had to make a single cut to any of our staff. We have 18 full-time employees that are employed by Gators Baseball Academy. And what we've asked those employees to do is to provide value to the families. Man, so things like weekly we're doing what we call GBA TV. So GBA TV is a Facebook Live program that we post on Monday nights, and we bring on, you know, everything from, you know, St. Louis Cardinal professional coaches to high school coaches from the area. We do tips of the week and, you know, just constant dialogue with our families. We've launched virtual online lessons. So through the utilization of tools like say Blast Motion or K-Best or things of that nature, we have the ability to provide, you know, true online virtual lessons, or we can give our families the capability of uploading videos, giving us a chance to analyze them, and then providing feedback. So those are just a couple of the examples of how we've really activated this whole virtual landscape.
Yeah, and one thing I think I'll say, and I think we'll get into this later too, is that, you know, that virtual integration can be a permanent feature of what you're doing as an organization to add value. You know, one of the adages I like is there doesn't have to be a rain out again, right? Or more importantly, there's things that you can do that add more value, that go beyond what happens on the field. I actually think we're going through the world's greatest brand exercise. If I had sat with Joe and Keri and Donny and Charlie and said, okay, guys, you can't play baseball at all, but you have to add value as an organization. What would your value be? How do you articulate that value? And that would be a theoretical exercise to say, hey, what you do is bigger than just what happens between the lines. Well, now you're actually practicing that. But if you learn and understand that, it becomes interesting to think about how that becomes a permanent feature. Donny, to bring you in, one thing I think a lot of organizations have challenged with is how they're navigating and dealing with parents, maybe even coaches in this time, where they've invested resources and time, and, you know, whether it's asking for refunds or having those difficult conversations. How do you kind of manage that? And have there been challenges around that? And what are the ways that you've tried to add value during this period of pause?
Oh yeah, there's definitely challenges with it. The first and foremost is we got to respect each individual parent and player. Everybody has a different safety issue. They may have pre-existing conditions. So the first thing we got to do is respect. I think, you know, across Finesse, everybody wants to get back on the field. And so we're obviously working with the governors like everybody else. Ohio's starting to open up. Most of Michigan is still is shut down. Each team has its own budget, and of course, parents are paying player fees. We kind of stopped it when we got shut down March 12th, I believe it was, until we have a better idea of what our final expenses are going to look like. So we're making adjustments that way. You know, one of the challenging parts we'll have with it is, you know, working with companies like Keri, who Triple Crown's been great to us. We've been doing their events forever, and trying to work with them instead of, if we can't make, you know, it out to Colorado, we're working with them to try to do more local events, but we're also trying to work with them in credits. And when we do that, the challenging part for us is we have different rosters every year for every team. So if we're getting a credit for a future tournament, how do we apply those credits? So we've asked the parents to be patient. You know, we still don't know what the final summer is going to look like. We don't know if we're going to extend further into August and possibly early September with our existing teams. And just keeping them updated on the financial part and letting them know that we'll adjust as our final budget adjusts.
Yeah, it's important. One thing we've seen, there's a communications expert by the name of Charlie Hawk that we've done some work with, and he's involved in our Slack group. And I'll have someone post the blog post that we did with him. But he basically is, you know, not only advises Fortune 500 companies on both difficult conversations for executives and also sales training, but also happened to run a local soccer club in Pennsylvania. And one of the things he said is, bad news is not like wine; it does not age well, right? So the idea is that if you know, so first thing is like, how are you communicating, whether it's about refunds or credits? How are you being out front about that? The second thing he talks a lot about is if you're not communicating, people are making up in their heads whatever answers they have to their questions. And usually it's much worse than whatever answer you were going to provide them. So you're much better communicating, even if you don't have all the answers, because otherwise they're filling that gap with their own answers, which may often not be what it is that the answer you want them to have. So that constant communication, I think, is another important part of that. Charlie, I think as we think about this return to play, and you think about, you've spent a lot of time focusing on, you know, as you mentioned, like, especially the communities you serve, where it's just basically a question of food access is critical. How do you think about where baseball and softball fits in? How are you thinking and anticipating about where you're able to offer that? And what are you thinking about in terms of return to play?
You've hit us with a few quotes. I'm going to give you one back. So I've told our staff, being creative in times of stress is like going on a run through hot and humid weather. it's possible. You just got to put a lot more effort in. So at this moment, our staff has become essential workers. In a couple more weeks, we are going to go virtual with our summer program and our summer league. So I call it YBA Play TV. So our free instructional league is called YBA Play. I've watched Blue's Clues and Nickelodeon clips the past couple weeks to get my head around how to make a engaging, creative, youth development centric baseball episode. So June 15th through August 7th, we've committed to do Play TV via our Nats Facebook Live. Myself and a couple of our other softball and baseball coaches will be the main characters. So that's one thing. And incentivizing participation by having families pick up a wiffle ball bat at the academy. So our doors are still open for meals. So I'm trying to be creative and have a themed week each week over this. Yeah. So pick up a cap at week 1, pick up your wiffle ball bat. We're still able to purchase some items for that. And Max Scherzer, our star pitcher, was able to donate a few thousand wiffle ball sets for that purpose.
That's awesome. Well, and it's interesting, and remind me, because I know one of the creators of Blue's Clues, so we'll follow up offline. So you don't have to only watch YouTube videos. But Keri, I think one is it's inspiring. You talk about what sports teaches you, right? And that's at the heart of what the Nationals are doing. But as you try to bring sports back and you're leading the way, how are you thinking about return to play? What does tournament play look like? Is it more local? Are you anticipating the same kind of travel? What are the safety precautions you're thinking about? Because I know you've been really diligent about this. And what advice can you share for organizations out there?
Yeah, we've just kept the communication pipelines going heavily, and Donny probably knows my dad, Dave King, who's teaching the TC Stars how to play softball here every Tuesday and Thursday, and they travel all over the country. Top 50 club in the U.S. We produce some good kids out of Fort Collins, Colorado here. Believe it or not, even though we don't get a full season of sunshine like in SoCal, we still get some good ball here. But one thing we have to do is definitely make sure that the parent and the kid are safe. And that's a huge component is even if it's state opens up, you're seeing restaurants still not populated in Florida in full capacity. So it's because they don't want to go in there. And if somebody doesn't want to come to the ball field because you haven't done your diligence to separate people, to make sure there's proper hygiene, and do the list of what Dr. Kathryn McElheny said, then you're not doing the right things at this point. It still is tough to get to the governor's office because the decision-making, when you look at it, normally happened at the Parks and Rec level. And what's going on now is they're deferring to the health department. Health department's deferring to the governor. And the governor's saying, hey, health department, give me a plan. And so nobody's done anything.
Right.
And so what we've had to do is give the plans over. And just last night we had the state health department of Colorado as well as the county health department on the same phone call, and they are willing to come and watch a socially distant game with no fans, a 3-inning game, and then we're going to have a transition with fans right after it for another 3 innings. And so they're going to get to see not only what it looks like from a gameplay standpoint on the field, but also what it looks from a crowd management, which is really, when you get down to it, there's a lot more issues around the crowd assembling than actually it looks like the game. For the most part here in Routt County and Larimer County, it looks like we've been able to figure out how to get the game pretty much appeased to the health expert in the county. It's the crowd. And so defining a field as a separate entity in a complex is also another goal of ours, to get to a square footage arena, because you literally can stuff 13 fast food restaurants in a softball field and 27 inside of a baseball diamond. And so there's really not much issue when it comes to gameplay. It's a quite socially distant sport naturally. There's a reason they call it being out in left field. There's nobody there with you. I mean, it's by yourself. And so those moments at first base and pickoffs, and we can adapt the rules fairly quickly on command for the local health department of the county. Right now we've encourage no rule changes. So we're allowing stealing, keeping the umpire behind the catcher, but we can easily make those modifications to the game if they're necessary to start or to ramp up. And our customers are willing to do it at a last resort. Right now, they want to keep the game intact, but they are willing to move. So we've just done so much communication with the customer to find out what they're willing to do, and then reaching out to all the policymakers to try and aid them to say that this could be a sport that rolls out other sports. And it just already is kind of a natural sport for this. It is America's pastime, baseball. And so it's got a lot of legacy and cachet, and Congress and people understand the sport. I'd say there's quite a few more people playing baseball than Quidditch, for example, at this point.
Right.
Which, by the way,
sure.
Quidditch is no longer allowing the sharing of a mouth guard, which is a good move by Quidditch.
But I think you can share brooms. Is that, but anyway.
Even brooms, hopefully they go with the mouth guard for sure, though.
So Donny, to build on that, how are you thinking about return to play? Are you modifying practices? Are you what are the ways that you're preparing to kind of bring kids back? As you mentioned, Ohio is also a little bit different than Michigan.
Yeah, we're actually having some, as far as practices go, because we're so close to the border, of looking at having some of our practices in Ohio. But again, we're hoping here in Michigan that we're going to hear from our governor the next couple of days and open it up. But it's like, the distancing, having 10 or less, making sure that you're breaking them up. When we're doing hitting in tunnels, we'll encourage the girls to bring their own balls. So they hit their balls, they come out, next kid comes in. So there's less of that going on. The real challenge for us, Jeremy, is what does travel softball look like in the future once we get back to? I mentioned we're a national program, and it's not uncommon for my team to be in Florida and Texas and Colorado and California. We're going to have to cut back on that. We're not going to be able to travel as much. We're going to look at how we can play more local, how we can minimize the stay in hotels, and of course working with Keri and Triple Crown, they're looking to have events that are more local. And the other thing that's really important to us is working with the colleges. The budgets of the college programs are getting hit hard. Even I talked to Rachel Lawson yesterday from Kentucky, Jen Allard with, even at Harvard with their great endowment, they have budget freezes, budget cuts. And we need to work with those colleges. What will that look like? We're going to look at when it's safe to get back on campus of coming to those colleges and actually playing on their fields, maybe giving some money back to them when they've supported us recruiting our kids. And we're also going to encourage them to do more camps so that they go on site where the college coaches don't have to travel as much. So really looking, we're still going to do national events, but it's going to look different. Our travel schedule is going to look different. And again, we've been on umpteen calls, Zoom calls with the directors like Triple Crown, and working with them that how can we create these new events. And
one of the theories that we have a lot is the people that are running the most entrepreneurial organizations, for-profit, nonprofit. If you're running and delivering great experiences, that is ultimately what people are going to want. And whether that's more local, more regional, eventually more national, whatever that looks like, if Triple Crown runs the best tournaments, whether they're a local tournament or regional tournament, national tournament, that's still a feature of what that is. And same thing on the organizational side. Joe, from your perspective, how are you thinking about kind of the safety protocols around return to play? And you also have the ability to compare to volleyball, which is, the recommendations coming out from U.S. volleyball are a lot more stringent, a lot of which is basically recommending that people don't even come back into facilities or indoor facilities, the nature of the game of volleyball. So what is the way that you're thinking about, on-field play, knowing that you're doing a lot of pioneering work on the virtual side?
Yeah, so when you compare baseball with volleyball, for those of us in the baseball world, the volleyball world is heavily sanctioned, and USA Volleyball really controls a lot of the efforts that the clubs are sort of rolling out, all the way down to the region. And if you compare that to baseball seems a bit more entrepreneurial, maybe a bit more cowboyish in terms of, kind of how you roll programs out. So those two worlds are vastly different. The other thing that is different, obviously, is that volleyball is an indoor sport and baseball you can do outdoors. My experience with the Florida Gulfside Volleyball Academy here in Naples and the Gators Baseball Academy in St. Louis is that we actually have the ability to take advantage of both. So for volleyball, what we've been able to do is we worked with our contacts at USAB, we worked with our contacts at the Florida region, and then of course with local authorities. And what we've done is we've put a return to play program that is outdoor specifically for volleyball. So we've secured an outdoor piece of land for our volleyball club. We procured outdoor volleyball nets, and what it's going to look like is it's going to look like a very focused effort on individual skill training and some sort of a modified conditioning, if you will. Because in volleyball, there is, all you have to play toward in terms of competition is the national event. With the national event being canceled, all that's left for volleyball is what they're calling phase 1 and phase 2, which is basically individual training, individual conditioning, and then possibly some local maybe scrimmages. So having parents accept the fact that, listen, we're going to continue to train, we're going to continue to play, especially if you're not in that recruitable age, it's okay. Take a deep breath. Let's use this time to just kind of get better, build community, maybe have some perspective on life, and that's how we're going about it, Jeremy.
So, and Joe, one question as you think about bringing people back in, and even your baseball programs, how do you think about navigating some of the liability issues? And is that stuff that you're focusing on from an insurance or legal perspective?
Yeah, both. Absolutely. So we do have a waiver that we have all parents sign, for any of the families that are going to come back, and we've got a very set of strict rules in terms of how many kids on the field, how many coaches, where parents can be and can't be. But liability is certainly an important thing to us, and we make it very very well known to our families.
Yeah, Charlie, I got to imagine, especially as a pro team, you have to take the liability questions really seriously. So how are you thinking about, especially if anyone's coming in the facility now, how do you think about managing risks around liability and related to the concerns around safety?
Right. So for staff right now, I had to get my temperature check before greeting you all. But for children, it's going to be even more strict. A lot because of our brand, but a lot because of MLB too. So we were on a call last week with MLB, and they're helping us, each urban academy from across the country, develop a COVID related liability waiver. So that's one thing. I wanted to say another point. A lot of you probably know that the YMCA and the American Camp Association just published some guidelines, and I was reading through them. I think some of those points are helpful. And Dr. Kat mentioned concentric circles. That's what we're looking towards. Our biggest program is our holistic enrichment program for 3rd through 8th graders. And we have about 150 scholar athletes within that. We're already thinking about dividing each grade into subgroups or concentric circles. So those kids are the only kids they're with. And the one coach, we're going to assign one coach to them just to make, once we open, hopefully in the next 8 weeks, we'll be very cautious about who is together when they're at our facility.
Yeah, it's one of the things I'll highlight is I'm seeing that pattern across sports where you're often having people come back in cohorts. So it's groups of people that are coming together and ultimately are able to, it's the same group of people that are practicing with the same coach every time, and they're using that as a way of kind of minimizing risk associated with that. Donny, quick question for you is as it relates to, part of the question of how you get parents to kind of sign up for your programs is, the predictability, the value they're going to get. So how are you getting them to sign up and reinvest in your programs when there's maybe some uncertainty about if it gets disrupted? Is there such demand that that's not a concern, or how are you communicating the value proposition when there's uncertainty around it?
Yeah, we definitely have an advantage. Being around since 1986, we've got good name brand. And so there's many kids in our marketplace that, want to be part of Finesse. So we really haven't had that be an issue. It's just more like you say, stay in communication with them, let them know that there's going to be changes. But we don't have, we have the opposite. It's not a mass exodus. It's like they can't wait to get going. That's the feel that we're experiencing right now. And so, some of the stuff we're doing, of course, the kids are working hard at home. Finesse recently signed on with Last Motion, so that we know that hitting metrics are going to be very important to the college coaches. We're also doing streaming through Athletes Go Live. The college coaches have said, stream your practices if you have to. If we can't be out because of either our budgets, NCAA dead periods, or just from a health standpoint, we want to be able to see your kids. So it's just adjusting to, as soon as we can open up, we're ready to go. We haven't had like a concern about max exodus at all. And maybe we're lucky, but that's what we're having right now.
Yeah. So Keri, a couple of questions that come in for you. One is a question of, how do you think about your responsibility versus the facility's responsibility when it comes to safety? If the safety responsibility of that, and also the liability, and how that comes to be, is the first question to you. And then the second is a perspective on recruiting and how that may shift and adapt, whether it's college budgets are being cut, scholarships may be impacted, or the fact that it may be harder for some of the showcases for them to get to.
Yeah, when it comes down to the facility question first, we're hearing from several municipalities that they're having pretty big cuts to their Parks and Rec district, and still today about 93% of all fields that are used by kids are public or school facilities. So, I mean, you really got to have a municipality, in a good place in order to have a ball field to play on. And so what we're hearing is, can you help us out? And we're willing to do that. We're willing to, put signage up. We're willing to spray dugouts. We're willing to spray baseballs. We're willing to, put a safety director at a complex to ensure social distancing, and also to ensure that there's not protesting. I know this sounds kind of silly, but we have some communities that don't want this kind of impact, and so they've threatened to, gather and assemble to where they can show us that there's no way for you to properly manage social distancing. So we're working with the municipalities to try to help out at unprecedented levels. And also in some communities that were already a little bit struggling, we've been helping them with the actual maintenance of the field, the dragging of the infield, making sure that the mounds tamped out, all those different little features that make a baseball or softball field work. We are helping more. We see us helping more in the future to do that. And when it comes to recruiting, this thing changes so often, it's hard to stay in front of it. But we do believe that college sports will be in existence in the future. And so we have, 20 athletes that get recruited out of Triple Crown, our 4 teams every year. And, they're worried, some of them, do they really want to go to college now? Are they in the right place? It comes down to a central element, when it's recruiting. If that's the only reason you're playing, that's probably not a good reason to only play, is the college aspect. The game itself provides so much more than just a college degree. College on campus, though, kids want the social interaction. That's part of the learning experience. They want the team interaction. That's part of the deal. So if they can't have those things, there's a lot of kids saying, I'm not quite interested in online learning. I might as well take a gap year. And so we are hearing that from the current seniors that are rolling into college. They're worried about what that future holds. And then, of course, they're looking down at the juniors that are coming into our program saying, the kids are really just asking questions. Do I really want to do this? And as long as they love to compete, they love the thrill of victory and that agony of defeat, I really focus on that agony part. I think you learn so much more when you lose. So I don't mind when our program loses, just as long as you learn a lesson. So we're focusing on the sport, the game, getting outside, being active. The things you learn as being a part of a team, you become recruitable in the workforce much more. I mean, I find myself calling the old head coach they'll give me a list of references. I say, who is your favorite coach? I call the coach now and say, did they ever leave practice early? Did you kick them out? Did they stick it through when they were sucking? Did they get there? Right. Did they pick themselves up when they fell down? Because the coach sees it. When you're looking just at academics, they can fudge that stuff. They can cram the night before and they can depart early. A coach knows a lot about an athlete.
It's a good point. and it's not just about the college experience. It's what makes you successful in the world. Joe, give me a couple sentences as you think about the best opportunity that comes out of this, because you're an optimist, you're an innovator, you're trying to use this period. What's a permanent feature that you've learned about your organization and the opportunity that you see coming out of the kind of COVID crisis that you think will be part of the innovations for baseball moving forward?
And I think everyone on this call has just really reinforced the fact that sports is just such an important part of life. We believe in the journey, we believe in the experience, and we're trying like heck to get our families so focused on getting to the quote unquote Division I baseball world, and we're trying to open their eyes to there are so many different things that you can do with this game that it can take you to, but as importantly, as Keri mentioned, there are things to learn while you're experiencing this. So if anything, Jeremy, I think this COVID thing has really helped us reinforce that with our Gator Baseball Academy families. That's
so great, and I think it's a great segue to Charlie, and I'll give you a final perspective, because one of the things that you're focusing on is the communities that need it the most, and it's amazing to think about how baseball is such a vehicle for those communities. So when you think about the challenges that underserved communities have, and sometimes that we may not think about or see every day, what is the way that the broader baseball community can help those that need it most? If you had a few sentences to sum that, what would you advise them?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of our families are worried about dinner tonight and not baseball practice tomorrow. But we can be a helpful support for parents and families during this tough time. I mentioned we've reinvented our operations. Baseball is the tip of the iceberg, but if we can provide critical supplies and essential supplies and hot meals every day of the work week, it's pretty darn pivot, if you ask me. But we're youth developers first and foremost at Nats Academy. So we know Zoom fatigue is going to set in, but we know this is the only social connection our children have through this small square. So myself and my staff, we have to ensure that our kids are still having structure. Some of our kids, I've talked to them through virtual home visits, and they're kind of numb right now. So if we create structure through guided practice every day, if we continue to create a sense of belonging and membership, and then make sure our kids have the ability to have self-awareness and ability to reflect with us during this time, then they'll be much better come August and into the fall and get out of this.
Yeah, it's powerful. So as we wrap up, I want to thank our outstanding panel. What I think it's been amazing is not only when you think about return to play, it's not just about getting back on the fields and the livelihood of organizations and communities. It's really about this vehicle for youth development and for broader impact in our communities. So I think that there's a huge opportunity for us to make a huge difference in society, and I think you all are great embodiments of that. So we appreciate your resiliency, which, as Keri reminds us, baseball and sports teach you. Baseball as much as any sport, baseball and softball. So I think the ability to apply that resiliency to come back and thrive is important. And when you're driving around and you see kids on baseball fields again and kids on softball fields again, it will feel like we'll appreciate like that never before. So thank you all for giving us a lot of guidance and perspective. I'll encourage everyone to go to the Slack group. We'll post that information again in the follow-up note so that you can continue the conversation. Hear some of the great ideas that the speakers have shared, share documents, return to play plans, liability waivers, lots of different ways to do that tool. So check out that if you want to be part of it. And thank you very much for being here and joining us at this town hall. Have a great day, everybody.
You guys.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Thank you, guys.